Let's turn to Romans 14, the study entitled Feast and Fast and Food, Oh My. And I updated this commentary last week or something to that effect, and I added a new section entitled Introduction, Background, and Historical Audience. And I apologize that this section should have been there a long time ago. It should have been there when I first put the study together a year ago. But I didn't think I would need to have so much background to support the perspective that I'm trying to present. I thought it would be somewhat self-evident if I just showed you certain scriptures and things like that. But based on the interaction that I'm getting from the students and the pushback, which is healthy, from people who are watching the videos, and most of this is done via email. Some of it's done via the YouTube comments, and some of it's live with my live students. But based on the pushback, based on the questions, based on the healthy resistance to the position I'm presented, this means I've got people thinking. And so it forced me to go back and put just a little bit more background and historical audience that I feel actually supports the position that I'm taking on who Paul was writing to and why it's relevant for us today. So give me a second. Let me blow this up because it'll be easier for me to read. And it'll be easier for you to see. I think 400 was what I experimented with. All right, so we've been reading through these notes. Let me just scroll down to where we left off. Give me a second here. All right, we left off last week talking about who is Paul writing to and why is it important for us to know the background? Generally speaking, let me just say this up front. Generally speaking, it's agreed upon by biblical authorship, biblical research, both Christian and non-Christian. So we've got research that can fall on two sides of the tracks. We've got research that comes primarily from Christian resources that's churned out of seminaries and pulpits and commentaries, and much of it is Christian in nature, that meaning it's written by Christians for Christians. But at the same time, I'm sure you would agree with me that we needn't discount the importance of researching a topic using historical resources, whether that historical resource is a book Christian or not. Because at the end of the day, we're talking about events that took place on planet Earth, not on a different planet. And therefore, historically speaking, the Bible is, among other things, a history book at the end of the day as well. Yes, it's theology. Yes, it's God's inspired words given to mankind, but it is also history. And so to the extent that we can use historical research from historians, whether they're Christian or not, shouldn't matter. We're looking for those who are experts in their field. And so sometimes historians can come alongside and augment and back up and bolster an argument that a Christian author might be presenting, or sometimes the reverse. Christianity, in its haste to get theology out of the door, will sometimes skimp on the historical details, or they're not prepared to address the historical because they're not really trained in that field. And thus we can use, sometimes you'll hear Christian authors spit out some fact, and what turns out to be, it's not very historically factual, and so we have a historian that'll come and kind of clean that up a little bit. And so, but at the end of the day, it's not to shame the Christian authors, nor to look down on them, nor to even diminish the central message that the Bible's trying to teach, by reducing it to a history book. That's not what I'm trying to do. The point I'm trying to make is that in our effort to study the Bible, let's use the resources that are available to us, and if that includes historical authors, then that works as well. So what we're doing is we're looking at history, and what I have found in my research is that what Paul is dealing with is primarily a group of Christians. He's writing to Christians. The brothers are Christians, but it's done within within a worldview, within a social setting that is aware of the Judaisms and the Jewish presence around them. How big or small that is, that's what we're trying to ascertain by looking at this part of my commentary. So we're talking about the expulsion from Rome of the Jewish presence right around the time that Paul was probably putting his letter together, right in the mid-50s of the first era. And why that would be important for us is perhaps if Rome expelled a good number of Jewish people from the region at the time that Paul sent the letter, well then the readership which would have been believers, the brothers, largely would have been comprised of Gentiles. And thus, we have a Gentile majority and Jewish minority, and this would maybe lend a certain flavor to the letter. Paul being aware of the expulsion, Paul being aware of the dynamics of the groups, perhaps maybe played into that, and perhaps maybe that explains why maybe in the end we don't really have a strong emphasis on Jewish values and things like that. Maybe he's really writing to a Gentile audience and he just wants them to kind of go their merry way and don't worry about the unsaved Jews, those people who got kicked out of Rome. But if the expulsion was not as large as we might have been taught, I'm not saying it didn't happen. I do believe it happened. But if it wasn't as extensive as we thought, then perhaps maybe Paul wanted his Gentile audience to still retain their awareness of their Jewish communities that they're placed among. Even more so, perhaps Paul wanted his Gentile Christian audience to have a responsibility to the unsaved Jewish communities that were around them. So let's talk about that topic. So last week I finished up at the end of this paragraph, and we're ready to talk about the expulsion that Emperor Claudius, tried to make or sought to make, relevant and informative or what should we say? A historical event that would kind of move things along in a direction that he wanted to, put the Jews out because they're troublemakers. But let me read this paragraph one more time, and stop doing that. I need to turn off that setting. Let's read this as a segue into this week's study, and I think I'll finish this section tonight. Here's what I have to say. I found that most Christian authors tend to prefer to play up the expulsion by Claudius, allowing it to define the audience in Romans as a Gentile majority and a Jewish minority sort of way, resulting in the Gentiles turning out as the strong, i.e. the powerful, and the Jews turning out as the weak, i.e. those without power. And I'm purposely making reference to a commentary that I referenced maybe last week or a week before about, it was put together by a Christian group, Biblical Bible Project or something. I can't remember the name off the top of my head. I'll look it up later. But they talk about how that the strong mentioned in Romans 15, perhaps a better way to understand this word strong is as the powerful, which would kind of directly tie it into the fact that the Gentiles were the majority. And being Roman citizens or something to that effect, in the social setting of their day, they would have had power, they would have had privilege to do certain things that Jews wouldn't have. That means the Jews that survived, that were still in Rome at the time of Paul's writing, or had begun to return once the edict had expired at the death of Claudius, which we're going to read about here in a moment, then this would put the Jews in the minority position, socially speaking, and perhaps the word that Paul used, which is an alpha privative with a negative of the word powerful, so it's like the unpowerful. We just simply have an alpha privative in front of the word power. Dunatos and andunatos is something to that effect. So those without power. This would make sense to be describing the Jewish minority in the social setting. So I like that approach. I think it has some weight to it. I can kind of run with that. But Paul's also talking about, remember he says, the weak in faith. So how does that play into the idea of the position I'm taking, that the weak in faith were actually those Jews? I do believe they were the ones that were weak, but I don't believe the weakness was due to their social status. It could be, right? That would seem to make sense. The weakness being without power, those in a social status where they were the minority. But there seems to be some other ways to view this phrase, weak in faith, and that could be weak in the faith of Messiah. But let's keep studying this a bit more. So, as I mentioned, I don't deny the basic premise about the expulsion, and it's historically accurate to describe the Gentile Christians as the majority and the Jewish Christians as the minority, especially if the snapshot of individual greetings provided by Paul at the end of Romans is any sort of representative sampling of the groups he was writing to, right? So go back and read Romans 16, and you'll see that the majority of people he's addressing at the end of his letter are Gentiles. So this would seem to go along with the idea that a majority of Gentiles are the recipients, a minority of Jews are the recipients, but to what degree were the Jews there and why does it matter? That's kind of where we're going with this. However, in my own limited personal research, I've learned that it is possible that the edict did not result in as many Jews being expelled as previously thought, and that those remaining Jewish communities actually very likely had an important impact on Paul's ideological framework from which to construct his letter, assuming we are correct in that Paul wrote the letter shortly after the Jews began to return back to Rome, which itself was after the death of Claudius in AD 54, making the exile last a mere short 5 years or so. So you understand where I'm going with that. I do believe the exile happened, but I don't believe it was as significant as we read about based on, and we don't have a lot of resources to work from anyway, so there's kind of some guesswork on either side of it. So you'd have to agree that my position is as plausible that there's probably more Jews that were present, as is the position that many Christians take that, hey, just all the Jews just kind of rolled over like an obedient Labrador retriever and just got out when Emperor Claudius said, get out. Is that what really happened? I'm not so sure about that. I go on to say, indeed, even mainstream Christian authors will readily admit that Jewish and Gentile social tensions and struggles represent some of the foremost concerns to our famous apostle to the Gentiles. So that's part of the reason why we're curious about who were the recipients. Again, let me make sure you guys aren't misunderstanding what I'm saying. I'm not supposing that it's not a Gentile majority and Jewish minority. I do believe that's the case. What we're trying to determine is, if since there was an expulsion, how many people were left behind, and to the degree that the expulsion impacted the tone of Paul's letter as to, is he just going to tell the Gentiles, just keep going on, you guys are the new, basically I'm paraphrasing, I'm overemphasizing, I'm using hyperbole is what I'm trying to say. You guys, you Gentiles, you don't really have to worry about Israel because they're kind of off to the side. You've basically replaced them for all intents and practical purposes, right? They rejected Messiah. So just kind of let me give you instructions on how do you live your lives. Don't worry about the Torah. Don't worry about Jewish identity. Don't worry about the synagogue life. Don't worry about Jewish authorities and things like that. Here's what you need to do to live your life. But let's again, I challenge, even though I don't hear pastors like saying it that exact way, Paul wasn't telling the Gentiles that they need to ignore the Jews. But practically speaking, it comes across as being and I use this phrase that I've borrowed from other historians, a zero-sum game. And when we talk about zero-sum, we're talking about if you took two circles that represented two different players in any given game, right? Player A on one side, player B on the other side. Well, then in a zero-sum contest, only one person can be the winner, which means the other person can be the loser, which means there's no sum, no addition of the sharing of the winnings, right? You can't have an overlap of the circles where in the middle there, you win and I win. That's not zero-sum mindset, zero-sum philosophy, or zero-sum concept. Zero-sum is where one wins and the other loses. And so in terms of theological concepts, when it comes to practically describing the way Romans and the way Paul wrote, many Christian theologians, without even realizing it, often describe the church as inheriting all the blessings and Israel inheriting all the curses. Thus, the church wins and Israel loses. That's a zero-sum concept. That's what we're challenging. All right, so Wikipedia, we quoted them earlier, and they again make this careful note. Here's what I have to say about the expulsion. A brief statement in Divus Claudius 25 mentions agitations by the Jews, which led Claudius, Roman emperor from AD 41 to 54, to expel them from Rome, right? So we know that already. This is common history, but let's keep reading. Here's what that quote from Claudius reads. Since the Jews constantly made disturbances at the instigation of Chrestus, he, the Emperor Claudius, expelled them from Rome. All right, so let's talk about the expulsion. The expulsion event Suetonius refers to is necessarily later than AD 41. So we're talking about one historian named Suetonius, or Suetonius, as I've heard it described. And he describes the expulsion, but not in a lot of detail. he simply gives these details. This is what we can infer. It is necessarily later than AD 41 and earlier than AD 54. And of course, we say earlier than 54 because that's the date that Emperor Claudius was actually murdered. So he couldn't have given an edict after he was murdered. They go on to say, the expulsion is mentioned in the last quarter of a list of Claudius's actions during his reign. However, precisely dating the expulsion from Suetonius provides some challenges because Suetonius writes in a topical rather than chronological fashion. Let me scroll up here. Necessitating the use of other texts to pinpoint the time. The dating of the Edict of Claudius for the expulsion of Jews relies on three separate texts beyond Suetonius' own reference, which in chronological order are the reference to the trial of the Apostle Paul by Galileo in the Acts of the Apostles, right? Acts 18:2, which we read last week. Then we have the reference by historian Cassius Dio's reference in history. We have a reference to his work there. And then we have, lastly, a Christian author, Paulus Orosius' 5th century mention in history, 7.6. That's a reference that we're going to look at here in a moment. And these are of Orosius's reference is of a non-extant Josephus reference. So historians reference, well, he made reference to a quote from Josephus, but we don't even have that reference anymore. Where's your primary resource? They go on to say, most scholars agree that the expulsion of Jews mentioned in the book of Acts is consistent with this report by Suetonius. And that's interesting that that we have a historian agreeing with the writer to the book of Acts, which of course would have been Luke, which is good. This tells us that Luke had his ducks in a row, although Luke didn't give us all the details. And we also notice that Luke simply recorded that Claudius issued a decree for the Jews to be expelled. We don't know whether or not the Jews followed through or whether it was carried out to the extent that perhaps maybe it was written down. Donna Hurley notes that the Acts provides a date of 49 and adds that neither Tacitus nor Dio reports an expulsion in 49 or 50, as we'd have expected if there had been a large exodus of the Jewish community, concluding that all, like Luke writes about, is probably hyperbole. So we have all of the Jews were expelled from Rome, is what Luke wrote in chapter 18. Well, was he just talking about all of the Jews? Was it kind of an overstatement? Or did he mean all of the Jews of a certain faction, even though he didn't write the word faction? How are we to understand that? There's a little bit of ambiguity, a little bit of, what do we call it, equivocation going on there. They go on to say, the passage may suggest that in the mid-1st century, the Romans still viewed Christianity as a Jewish sect. Now, this is an important detail that we need to kind of perk up and listen to. We're fond of saying that Christianity survived on their own, minus the Jewish presence in Rome. But to what degree would Christianity have been viewed by the Roman society as a separate religion? Romans viewed Christianity as a sect of Judaism. So if you're going to kick all the Jews out, what about these sectarian Jews? I'm using air quotes with my fingers to refer to the Christians. Let's consider that. Keep that in your mind when you're reading all of these historical accounts. Historians debate whether or not the Roman government distinguished between Christians and Jews prior to Nerva's modification of the Fiscus Judaicus in AD 96. So what's going on is that there was an emperor who came along later, right, towards the end of the century in AD 96 by the name of Nerva, and he modified the existing what we call Fiscus Judaicus, which was a tax that would have imposed certain levies against the Jewish communities, but allowed them to enjoy certain religious freedoms like being able to hold public worship, to be exempt from certain emperor worship and Saturnalia worship, and giving their daughters to prostitution, forced prostitution, pagan prostitution, and so there was a good number of rules that your average Roman citizen, whether he was Jewish or not, would have been expected to adhere to in this day, unless you were afforded the exemptions under the Fiscus Judaicus. And so we could think of it in terms of being taxed. The Jews were taxed for their religious freedom. The non-Jews didn't have to pay that tax. Oh, well, yeah, if you weren't Jewish, you didn't have to do that. But if you were a religious group that was affiliated with Judaism, if you were a sect of Judaism, then you were you were exempted from this particular tax because you weren't part of Judaism. Sorry, if you were a sect of Judaism, then you paid that tax. But notice, historically speaking, from the period of 96 onward, practicing Jews paid the tax, but Christians did not. Now, why is that significant? Because it shows the development of the social religious distinctions that were being formulated around that time of year in Rome, separating Jews from the non-Jews when it came to religious practices. So what we're saying is, in plain terms, Rome recognized anyone who looked like a Jew, walked like a Jew, talked like a Jew, and worshiped the same religious God as the Jews as Jewish. This would include primarily the Christian groups who were subsets of Judaism. Remember, our own writers to the Apostolic Scriptures described Christianity as a sect of Judaism. They called it the way, and Paul talks about that as well. Even though the term Christian is brought up, it's still underneath the understanding of a Jewish subset, a sect, an offshoot of Judaism. So Christianity, as we know it today, was not really around in Paul's day. There was no separate religion known as Judaism. Rome forbade new religions from being formulated and being practiced openly or secretly in their day. Emperor worship was mandated, and to the degree that you didn't worship the emperor as a god, then you could be tried for treason, and you could be punished and perhaps even lose your life, depending on what charges were brought up against you. So the point was, a good Roman citizen worshiped the emperor and participated in the Saturnalia and all the paganism and the pantheism of gods and all of that, unless you were exempt through some of these, like I said, exemptions, because you were either Jewish or worshipped like a Jew, meaning the God-fearers fell underneath this exemption. And the Christians fell underneath this exemption up to a certain point when Rome began to separate who was a Christian and who was a Jew. Now that bears relevance for us if Paul is writing to Christians, but Rome is still considering that these Christians were attached to Jewish subgroups. Cassius Dio makes a comment in his works regarding an action early in the reign of Claudius. He states that, as for the Jews who had again increased so greatly that by reason of their multitude it would have been hard without raising a tumult to bar them from the city, Rome, he, Claudius, did not drive them out, but ordered them while continuing their traditional mode of life not to hold meetings. So this is interesting. Let's keep following this vein for a moment. The similarities are noteworthy, for both Suetonius and Cassius Dio dealt with Jews, tumult, Claudius, the city, and expulsion, and Cassius Dio does provide a chronological context that points it to the year AD 41. However, Cassius Dio does not mention Chrestus or any cause for the emperor's actions. Moreover, Cassius Dio says that Claudius did not drive the Jews out of the city, which prompts Slingerland to conclude that, quote, Suetonius Claudius 25 does not refer to the event narrated in Dio, chapter 60. Perhaps they're two different events or something to that effect. Rainer Reisner states that ancient historians generally hold that Cassius Dio here may have referred to an earlier, more limited action against some Jews, which was later expanded by Claudius to the expulsion of a larger group of Jews. And that's what I mentioned earlier, that perhaps we're talking about not as many people were expelled. Perhaps we're talking about all of the people in connection to a certain event or a certain disturbance in Rome or something to that effect. We'll see how this bears relevance later on in the study when I make a quote from Mark Nanus. Continuing with Wikipedia, the 5th century Christian writer Paulus Orosius makes a possible reference to the event, citing two sources. Let's read his record. Josephus reports in his 9th year the Jews were expelled by Claudius from the city, but Suetonius, who speaks as follows, influences me more. This is Orosius speaking. He says, Claudius expelled from Rome the Jews, constantly writing at the instigation of Christo, or rather, there's some typos going on or some ambiguities going on with this account because of the similarities between the phrase Christo and Cresto. We'll look at that in a moment. As far as whether he had commanded that the Jews writing against Christum be restrained and checked, or also had wanted the Christians as persons of a cognate religion to be expelled. It is not at all to be discerned. So what we're trying to say is that it's possible that when the Romans told the Jews to get out, that the Romans, we already know that they would have wanted, they didn't distinguish between Messianic Jews versus non-Messianic Jews. They just said all Jews. But if Christianity was still a subset of the Jewish religion at the time, then how would the Romans have been able to distinguish Christians from Jews when they said, all you worshipers of this God, this religion of Judaism, you guys get out? Wouldn't that have included many Christians as well? It would have impacted them. How could Rome at the time have said, okay, Jews, whether Messianic or not, you guys get out, but Christians, you guys can stay? And to make it even a little bit more complicated, how could Rome have distinguished Jewish Roman citizens from Christian Roman citizens when their religion looked nearly the same? The God-fearing Roman citizen, whether he was Jewish or Gentile, would have looked very similar to the Romans who were not religious, the ones trying to get everybody out. That's because some of the details that we have to begin to think about when we talk about, oh yeah, all the Jews got kicked out of Rome. Well, from our perspective today, when Judaism's so separate and distinct from Christianity, it's easy to imagine that, oh yeah, see that guy over there? See him? The one talking about Torah, the one talking about God, the one talking about a Messiah? Yeah, he's a Jew. Get rid of him. Oh, but see that guy over there wearing a cross, and he's talking about Jesus, and he's not wearing any religious garb. Oh, he's a Christian. Okay. By today's standards, it's easy to separate who's who, but in the first century, it wasn't as easy to separate who was really a practitioner of the Jewish religion. My point is that Christianity was still very much resemblance of Judaism, to the point that the Romans probably weren't as easy. The Romans wouldn't have had an easy time distinguishing who's who to kick out. I mean, we imagine that they kicked out we already know that they kicked out the Messianic Jews along with the non-Messianic Jews, particularly all the more if the argument was over matters of Messiah, Christ, right? Wouldn't the non-Messianic Jews would have said, wait a minute, don't kick us out. We're not Messianic Jews. We're not following after Christ. We don't have any vested interest in this Christ guy, this Jesus fella. Don't kick us out. Why kick us out? We're not the ones causing problems. But Rome would have just said, you know what? Jews who believe in Jesus, Jews who don't believe in Jesus, Jewish wannabes, you guys all look the same to us, and you're all causing problems, so just all of you, get out, get out, get out. In other words, Rome seems to be trying to purge that region of anything that was religiously Jewish, so that the result would have been a kind of a secular Rome that was left behind, secular to the point that it was allowed paganism and emperor worship, but it expunged itself of anything that smacked of this monotheistic Jewish religion that was rejecting Roman paganism. That's the point I'm trying to bring up. The first source used by Orosius comes from a non-extant quote from Josephus. It is this which provides the date of AD 49. His second source is Suetonius Claudius, which we've already read before. All right, so now let's go back to my own commentary. These are my own words. Why bring all of this up at all if Paul was in the end strongly pushing for Jewish and Gentile equality in the early Roman church, right? I mean, what's the big deal? What difference does it make how many Jews were actually expelled or not? Perhaps if we can allow that enough of the non-Christian Jewish community was present during Paul's penning of the letter, then we can begin to appreciate the very real social-religious dynamic that the predominantly Gentile Christian church at Rome had to contend with as they sought to implement Paul's life-changing gospel message and put into practice a very real, practical way that produced both spiritual and natural growth for both Jews and Gentiles in the, quote, household of faith, end quote, reference Galatians 6:10. You guys understanding what I'm saying here? If there were still a lot of Jews left around, what impact would they have had on Paul's writing, and how would Paul have wanted his Christian Gentile audience to be aware of the Jewish communities that were still there, and what concern would that have posed for the Gentile Christians who had suddenly found themselves in a majority position? Quoting Keener once again, we read concerning the expulsion. Let's turn to Dr. Keener like we quoted last time. He's got a heading in his study entitled Jewish and Gentile Elements in the Church, and this will be very informative for us. The church's origins in Rome probably stemmed from Jewish believers there, right? Reference Acts 2:10. But clearly it spread beyond them. Paul's audience was among the Gentiles, right? Read Romans 1:5. They were at least partly Gentile, again Romans 11, and probably mostly Gentile, Romans 1 and 16. Many contend that Jewish believers and God-fearing Gentiles remained in the synagogues in Rome for some time, explaining why Paul can presume so much knowledge of Scripture and Jewish perspective in the letter. You understand the point there? If there were not some Jewish people that remained in Rome for Paul when he wrote his letter, then how could he make so many references to Jewish scriptures if the Gentiles wouldn't have had resources? I mean, it's not like they could have just gone to down to their local Bible bookstore and picked up a copy of the Tanakh, right? The Old Testament, that wasn't there. So Paul makes a lot of references. In fact, comparing Romans with Galatians, these are the two letters that Paul quotes the most from the Tanakh. And yet, if the Gentile Christians supposedly didn't have any Jewish presence there to get resources from, like borrow their Torah scroll or something that in fact had access to the synagogues, because supposedly all of the Jews were kicked out. Well, then a lot of Paul's reasoning from Scripture would have fallen on deaf ears, because it would have been speaking to Gentile Christians who had no kind of firsthand knowledge of Jewish texts and things like that. At some point in the 40s, the Jewish community in Rome was apparently divided over questions of the identity of the Messiah, probably Jesus. As a result, the Emperor Claudius followed the precedent of the earlier Emperor Tiberius and banished the Jews from Rome, compare from the garbled accountant Suetonius Claudius. Given the context in our sources, this may have happened in about the year 49. He's not really saying anything different than what I've already talked about. However, let's keep listening to Dr. Keener here. Scholars debate whether the entire Jewish community actually left. That sentence alone should cause you to stop and just remember that history isn't always, especially ancient history, isn't always easy to interpret when you have very scant accounts of the details of what's going on. So you hear a pastor stand up in the pulpit and say, all the Jews were kicked out of Rome, and therefore this proves to us that Romans was written primarily to Gentiles, and therefore there wasn't really any Jewish presence at all, so Paul didn't really have to worry about any Jewish presence, so we don't really have to concern ourselves with that. But wait a minute. What resources are you quoting, Mr. Pastor? Where are you getting all this information from? Yes, Luke says that Emperor Claudius issued a decree, but that doesn't say that it was carried out the way that Emperor Claudius wanted it to happen, right? I mean, did he really have the power to just tell all the Jews, get up and get out? We're talking on the low end, maybe 20,000 Jews, and by some estimates on the high end, maybe 50,000 Jewish people, many of them perhaps Roman citizens, that were just told to get up and get out in the short space of about 5 to 10 years. Right? Let's stop and think about that for a moment. It would be difficult to reclaim property, right, if all 20 to 50,000 Jews got kicked out of a place. Hence, difficult to imagine generations of Jewish occupation coming to a complete end and then resuming their lives in Rome after Claudius' edict was repealed on his death in 54 CE, right? Just stop and use common sense for a moment. Let's keep reading. Certainly the many Jews who were Roman citizens would not have been expelled. I mean, stop and think about that. Roman citizenship was a highly sought after prize, commodity, a thing to have in Paul's day. And you could even appeal to it. Remember when Paul was put on trial, he appealed to his Roman citizen, hey, you can't do X, Y, and Z to me without certain, due process, because I'm a Roman citizen. I mean, the minute you mention, like Paul did in the book of Acts, that I'm a Roman citizen, then suddenly the Roman guards are like, oh, wait a minute. There's so, Roman citizens have a certain privilege about them as compared to, say, people who did not have Roman citizenship, or maybe slaves, or people groups who were living and mulling about in and throughout Rome, but didn't have this privileged citizenship. So if we've got historians telling us, not very many, 3, telling us that the Jews were expelled from Rome, but we don't stop to think, well, how many of those were Roman citizens? What about their rights? Could they have just been expected to get up and get out? I mean, wouldn't they have appealed? Didn't they have lawyers? So we have to stop and think about that for a second. We're just like rattling off all these facts that, all these Jews got kicked out. Oh, okay, they just rolled over like lapdogs and just got up and got out. They didn't stop to They didn't stop to appeal the fact that they were Roman citizens, or to object the fact that they've got certain rights or things like that. We don't stop and think about that sometimes, but we have to stop and think about that. Nevertheless, Dr. Keener continues, nevertheless, Luke, like Suetonius, speaks of Jews being expelled, right? Luke, in all fairness, simply mentions that the edict was issued. Luke doesn't actually say that they were expelled, if you go back and read the verse. At least the way I understand it. Though prudently admitting the cause, right? Luke doesn't say why they got expelled. Whether all were expelled and whether all who were officially expelled actually left, or at least those visible in the original conflict, must have left. So that's, again, very important. Whether all were expelled and whether all who were officially expelled actually left, at least those visible in the conflict must have left. So that's the fairness that we're trying to say. Yes, the expulsion took place. How many were expelled? We don't know. At least all those who were involved with the disturbance, we're probably expecting that all of those got. But when we say all got expelled, we don't have to say that it was all Jews. We could say, let's say there were 50,000 Jews in Rome at the time, and let's say 10,000 were involved in this dispute. That's still a high number. Let's say Emperor Claudius says, all you rabble-rousing Jews, get out. And let's say he has the power to kick out those 10,000. Well, hello, that still leaves 40,000 Jews living in Rome. That's still a sizable amount of people. So when Paul writes to the letter to the book of Romans, there's still a good enough amount of national Jews or unsaved Jews, a presence that would have represented enough people that brought it to Paul's concern that he's going to write a good portion of his letter, right, chapters 9 through 11, and deal with unsaved Israel, talking about them to the Gentile Christians. Let's finish this section right here, and then I think we'll stop at where it says conclusions, and we'll pick that up next week. Dr. Keener writes, Luke indicates that Priscilla and Aquila, Jews in Rome who were apparently already believers and possibly church leaders when Paul met them, had left, right? So I mentioned this earlier. The unbelieving Jews and the believing Jews both got kicked out, at least those within this certain, within the scope of this particular disturbance that we're talking about. It is likely that a substantial number of Jewish Christians and perhaps all their leaders left Rome at this point. So that's all we're talking about. This means that Gentile Christians had probably constituted the bulk of the Roman Church and its leadership for at least 5 years, and may represent a number of the house churches greeted in Romans 16. Those with Jewish leaders, as in 16, 5, and 7, may have organized after many Jews returned. Dr. Keener continues, given the different cultural orientation of congregations in the same city, probably at least as loosely connected as the different synagogues, it is not surprising that misunderstandings would arise between groups with a predominantly Jewish ethos. Some Gentiles, especially former adherents to the synagogue, may have held the Jewish position, and some, especially culturally sensitive Jews, probably including Aquila and Priscilla, may not have insisted on Gentiles observing the whole law, but at least two basic sides seem to have existed nonetheless. And we'll stop there with the quotes from Dr. Keener. Next week we'll finish this. This is quite lengthy. We'll finish with the conclusions to this part of my commentary that I've added, where we're trying to ascertain how many Jews were left in Rome, why does it matter to us when we're interpreting the book of Romans, and does it bear relevance for our interaction with maybe unsaved Jewish people today.